I'm recording it, but I need to step away for 1 minute. I'll be right back.
Okay, thanks. All right, Richard.
All right, well, yeah, here we are, and I'm trying to just get up my agenda. The first thing we need to do is to approve the minutes of the last meeting, which have been circulated, and I wonder if anybody has comments or wants to make changes. And I'm giving everybody a moment to speak up if you've got something to say. Otherwise, as we have been doing, we will deem the minutes to have been approved by consent. Thank you. All right. Next, we have reports from our liaison representatives, and I don't see Chad on the call yet. So why don't we skip that and maybe come back to that. Lauren, can you give us a report from Ag and Ecosystems?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Ag and Ecosystems, we have 5 different task teams that are working now on our various pieces of our full work plan as a subcommittee. We started talking quite a bit more in full subcommittee about land use policies and land use implications, especially with respect to renewable energy siting. And our carbon budget team just met. Jane can speak a bit more, obviously, to when we're going to be bringing on, oh, she's not there, going to be bringing on the consultants that are going to be doing both that work along with the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So talking a bit about that and how we're making sure that we aren't double counting or miscounting for those 2 different inventories that we're working on. And I guess we have our strategies that are going to be coming up, surfacing for the full subcommittee later in June. Between now and then, the task teams are developing strategies and using our multi-criteria analysis tool to bake in some objectivity and consistency across the task teams. So that's the update.
Lauren, can you talk a little bit more about the multi-criteria analysis tool and how, whether or not we talked a little bit about whether there's an opportunity to use it or use something similar here for us?
Yeah, it's a 1.5 page matrix that has different criteria and sub-criteria that we're assessing each of our strategies against. It is not to be used to prioritize, or it's not the final prioritization tool or metric that we're using, but it does provide an opportunity for us to award directionality to any strategy based on sub-criteria. So we have a climate resilience, does it promote drought resilience, for example, the strategy, and you either say it's a negative direction and actually worsens our ability to adapt to and be resilient in the face of drought. It's neutral, it doesn't have an impact on it, or it's beneficial. And there are, I think, 8 or 9 criteria, and each of them have at least 2 or 3 sub-criteria. Be happy to share it with this group if there's interest within the respective task teams here as they're developing their strategies. There would maybe need to be some room for adaption by this group, but I think that there's a lot of consistency across each of the subcommittees that could benefit from using it.
Great.
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, I think we would like to see it. So if you don't mind sharing that around. Can you give us a heads up at all on what you think the leading recommendations are going to be from the committee? Just any kind of a distant early warning message from you.
Can that be on my to-do for liaison breakout in 2 weeks?
Okay. Well, it's just good for us to know what are the major, topic areas that are going to be coming to us from that committee. Thank you. Anything else for Ag and Ecosystems?
No.
Okay. Jared, Science and Data, what's the report?
Thanks, Rich. So a few things, and Jane, please add if or any others who may have been at that subcommittee meeting yesterday, which was our last meeting. So I think the first thing, as I think most of you probably saw from her email to the council, is that unfortunately, Dr. Dupini-Giroux decided to step off of the Science and Data Subcommittee as co-chair. I know Jane and I were both able to have individual conversations with her, and thankfully she's still going to be available as a resource as specific questions come up in the subcommittee. But I think in terms of just prioritization and capacity, she had said that she wanted to focus primarily on the council responsibilities rather than on the subcommittee. And so there were a couple of things that we decided to do in the wake of that in terms of subcommittee composition. One is, thankfully, many of you attended the Great Just Transitions presentation. I don't know when that first was, a month ago, and heard from Dr. Bindu Panakar, and then also Professor Panakar presented the first part of the Climate Council meeting on, I guess, was that Monday? Was that this week? And so thankfully she is going to be attending the Science and Data Subcommittee, I think first as an audit, to use the educational term, to get a sense of what we're doing in the work plan. But I think we're hopeful that she will join, given the great work that she's doing and the expertise she has. And then in order to help TJ Poor carry the load as co-chair of the subcommittee, also decided to elect a new co-chair, which fell to me. So if any of you are emailing the Science and Data Subcommittee co-chairs going forward, you can include TJ and myself. I think one of the key takeaways from the subcommittee meeting is just how many great resources are very near to being available to us. And I'll defer it to Jane to give the update on the technical consultants, but I think that process is moving forward, and we're hopeful that they will, be on board and begin working with us in, a couple of weeks, perhaps. Jane can revise that. I think it's a similar time frame for the reference case scenario. TJ gave the update about the reference case scenario for the LEAP modeling exercise that's being led by NESCOM and SEI. So those were great pieces of news. I think another couple of things that we're looking forward to is, EAN is going to be producing a white paper to give more of an overview of our emissions reduction pathways analysis, which was summarized but not gone into in depth in the annual progress report we released for the state earlier this week. And then also we learned that the Vermont climate assessment is likely to be coming out in July. So a lot of good data reports analysis that is really going to undergird and inform a lot of our work going forward is either in development or near to being published or on board. So I think those were a couple of the key updates. Jane, anything that I missed? We also have discussed this, the opportunity and the benefit of doing probably an evening session and a more kind of public session around a conversation around some of the key decision points and kind of choices around the inventory methodology. And I think that we'll design that once we have the consultants on board, because that's one of their first key tasks, is some of the reviews of the other methodologies of other states and jurisdictions and how they're doing that, so that we can help frame up and have a really transparent and informed, careful conversation about some of those key issues, everything from life cycle analysis to global warming potential values and some of the other pieces. So stay tuned for that. Hasn't been scheduled yet, but there was a general interest among the subcommittee of hosting something that would be at a time that wasn't during the day and that could involve more folks. We've been lucky to have a number of non-council members of the public who've been attending, who've been doing a lot of really good research and providing helpful information about some of the key questions related to the inventory and carbon budget questions as well. I think that's it, unless Jane, you think I missed anything.
No, thank you, Jared. I was just going to use the opportunity to update on the RFP then, or not the RFP, the actual contract now. So the contract, the technical analysis contract is drafted, and it's with Megan O'Toole, who's on this call, who just also sent me a note saying that she's going to review it this afternoon, hopefully. And so based on that, the selected proposal that we're moving forward with was crafted in a way that seemed pretty easy to move into a contract, I'll say. So I'm really hopeful that as Megan and then our business office look at what I drafted in the contract, that it'll be a pretty straightforward negotiation to then send it off to the technical consultant to sign on, because we stalled in the communications and outreach contract for a number of weeks, largely because it wasn't an easy proposal to translate into a contract. So this felt pretty straightforward. So I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to turn it around really quickly now and share it with the consultant for them to sign quickly. So they could be on board as soon as, the end of next week would be ideal. And then I'll just put a pin in it for this sort of tension, maybe that I'm hearing. I heard a little bit at Science and Data yesterday, and then have further in other meetings around sort of the development of strategies. We've been thinking so much about, how to pause and wait to put out strategies and recommendations based on when we have that first phase of engagement back from the public's opinion on what they'd like to see shape and inform these strategies. But I'm also recognizing it is a real timing issue around sort of when we're going to know what with the technical analysis and how we put forward strategies that aren't informed necessarily by the technical analysis. And maybe that'll kind of come into bear as we start to talk about the policy template later in today's agenda, and with some ideas on how to mitigate that impact of not having the technical analysis for a while.
Thanks, Jane.
Go ahead.
So but the bottom line there, Jane, is you're hoping that the technical consultants can be on board by the end of next week. So starting the week after.
Yes, and their first priority will be the greenhouse gas inventory critique, as well as the carbon budget. Recognizing that they're sort of paused a little bit in waiting on to see what SEI and NESCON's work for the LEAP modeling. So that's still moving forward, which will give us some of the analysis we need here in this group.
Right. And Jared, you mentioned the EAN Pathways paper. Do you have a time estimate of when that would be available?
Yeah, so I think I've shared, I may need to actually share it with the full subcommittee. I know I had shared it with Rich and Peter as co-chairs. I didn't want to share the full model too far before the release of ANR's greenhouse gas emissions inventory, since it was based on that data and it was embargoed data. But I can now share with this full subcommittee the full model, but recognizing that a lot of folks who are doing this work and who are interested in this work, don't want to look at a spreadsheet model with hundreds of rows. We are also working on a short white paper summary that is kind of more accessible. And our awesome data manager, Mae Butler, is drafting that right now. And we are aiming to have that ready to share within about a month. But all of we feel good about where the pathways model is in terms of the sectoral pathways in the modeled measures. And I think all of the task leads have that information and have been using that to inform their discussions.
Thanks. Next, I think I saw Chad on the call. Chad, are you there?
Yeah. Yes. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everybody. Sorry, I was a few minutes late to join. So yeah, with respect to rural resilience, last Friday we spent a decent amount of time. We had a couple guests come and provide. So we had somebody from Green Mountain Power come and talk about, well, a few folks from Green Mountain Power come and talk about GMP's resilience tool. And, you know, it was, it's a great tool. And I think there's a lot of value in, you know, using it as a model for what we're doing here. So that was really helpful. And then we had someone from the state of Maine, somebody in the governor's office, state of Maine, Brian Ambrette, give us an overview of how the state of Maine handled resiliency in their Maine Won't Wait climate action plan. So that was really helpful as well. And he agreed to sort of be a resource moving forward. And so I think we gained a lot of good information from both of those discussions. And that was really kind of, I'd say that was probably the prime focus of last Friday's meeting. We do not, the meeting tomorrow has been canceled. So it won't, so we'll be meeting again in 2 weeks. And I think that's it. Jane, anything I may have missed there, or anything to go into any further detail on?
No, that was great, Chad. I'll just allude to them. The meeting was canceled tomorrow because the co-chairs of that subcommittee are stepping back and really thinking about work planning and a little bit of revisioning of the work plan that the subcommittee developed early on with the CBI's help, and to think about how they structure the work over the next few weeks and months leading to strategy development. And it really feels like a breakthrough in that, with that leadership there, about thinking about how and like what the focus of that work group subcommittee, I should say, is going to be over the next few months and how they organize their work. And so it's sort of a stay tuned, but I do think that like it was a having CBI engaged with them in a more thoughtful way around work planning and organization for that subcommittee was really helpful. And I think it's going to be really productive. And then just a little bit of follow up, that the purpose of Green Mountain Power being there and Maine, besides general navigation understanding, was one of their requirements in statute is they, being the subcommittee, is to produce a municipal vulnerability index. And so it was really to look at and think about existing tools and approaches that Maine took for similar vulnerability indexes. And we've actually come to a really productive place also the last few days about how we're going to sort of propose doing that. That'll go back to the subcommittee next week, but we actually think we'll have support through Green Mountain Power to just refine and add components to their tool, and they'll do it for us, which is even better. So with the grant they have. So it's really good work happening there right now, it feels like.
Thanks. Are there policy proposals or outputs from that committee that you all are thinking are going to need to come to cross-sector, or are you viewing that the work of the resilience is so much on the adaptation side that it's not something that cross-sector mitigation is going to need to do much with?
Well, Chad, I don't want to, there is one direct statutory requirement. Only one, it might be in two components, that actually I think is going to require them to take your strategies and recommendations and actually think about the application of them to rural communities specifically. And if I had my handy dandy statute in front of me, I could speak to it specifically, but it's really looking at efficiencies for mitigation requirements for like school buildings, rural, like town hall, like we should look at that. But they keep essentially saying that they have to wait to get work from cross-sector and then think about its application and impact on rural communities.
Yeah, I think
So
that,
there's a timing and sequence issue there.
Got it. So it's not that we're waiting for you, it's that you're going to be at some point you're going to be waiting for us. Sounds like.
yeah, I think so. Yep.
All right. Just transitions. Chris or Kelly?
Richard, I just wanted to say that land use is going to be part of transportation.
Right.
And that has bearing on both ag and ecosystems and resilience. So we need to be coordinated at some point along the way. I mean, we're going to be talking about smart growth,
yeah,
because you need that for reducing VMT. And that's part of resilience, and that's part of ag protection and other initiatives. So just throwing that out there. That's it's a giant issue.
It's a really good point.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Gina. Yeah, absolutely. Land use, smart growth principles, all those are going to be very, very significant issues that we grapple with.
I mean, it has bearing on floodplain protection and other issues.
Yeah. Yeah, infrastructure build out, absolutely, all of it.
All right, thanks. Chris?
Yes, I was actually gonna, I'll defer to, I was actually gonna say a quick thing, follow up to what Gina just mentioned, and because I feel like it's my job to do this. I'll just note that we also need to have the infrastructure to support compact settlement discussion, because until we actually have that, we're all just whistling Dixie and it's a bunch of, we can modify all the bylaws we want to, but until we actually have the infrastructure to support compact settlement, it ain't gonna happen. So
it's on our list.
good.
We have a list. It's on our list.
Kelly, I'm happy for you to take the lead, and I'll follow up if you want.
Yeah, works for me. Let me know if I miss anything. I think it's pretty brief. As we've been saying for a little while, we really wanted to get you all of these just transitions principles and everything and the tools that you need. We also want them to be good, and our committee did not quite reach consensus on approving them to send out to everyone at our last meeting. We're meeting again tonight, where we are basically, our entire agenda is finalizing them so that they can be ready. So we hope to have them for you. I think they're really useful. When I saw the draft, I was really pleased to see how it was coming together as something that I think will be a really useful tool. That, because we didn't want to hand you something that's like, oh great, thanks guys, a whole bunch of rules to follow and papers to, pages and pages to read. It seems very nicely laid out and leads you through how to think about things in a just transitions lens. So I think that's about it. And then Chris or Jane, anything that I missed? Oh, we did hear from the public engagement folks at the very end of our meeting. They didn't have as much time as they were supposed to have, because we were trying to finalize that draft. And they were just talking with us about helping to identify the actual stakeholders and folks that they're going to do roundtable discussions with. And we didn't really get to giving them names at that point, but that's still moving forward, and they want to start having those discussions very soon, I believe. Yeah, Jane, did you want to fill in more about where that stands?
Sorry, I was responding to a note to me. I missed that last part. But what I was going to speak to around the guiding principles was just in addition to having the language right, there was a lot of thought around how the rollout to the subcommittees around like training subcommittees on how to apply and use them. And I hope that we'll speak to that tonight, even though I know that the agenda is really focused on finalizing. I hope finalizing also includes sort of rollout to subcommittees and their application.
Richard, may I ask a question?
Thanks.
too?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for that update, you guys. Two questions, and Jane, you sort of put a little bit more fine point on it. In terms of how we apply these principles, I very much welcome that input. And I do wonder, and I mentioned this in the council meeting the other day, about like literally having them walk through a likely strategy with us, like, and applying it, like weatherization or some other, you know, potential strategy that we probably know is going to be in the hopper. That might be a helpful way. And one other just very tangential question, I don't know if it's come up, Kelly or Chris or others, Jane, if you've been, you know, you're following, people probably know Senator Rahm introduced an environmental justice bill this past session, which she had done a lot of work with different stakeholders as an overlay across state programs and state government to assess different strategies and state work in general. And I'm just curious if it has come up in just transitions and as some, you know, a complementary, ideally not conflicting, sort of a way to assess different strategies, and or if it could, you know, if this moves forward, how it might interrelate with our work. I'm just curious if you have talked about it or if you have thoughts on it, knowing it's still just a bill is introduced.
She spoke about that obviously at the EJ workshop that Just Transitions put on, spoke to the bill. We haven't talked about in great detail, like what I'm hearing you allude to, like a tool that she's proposing as part of that would be part of that bill, and the applicability to like strategies and recommendations coming out of the climate action plan. But maybe we should consider it. But I mean, it feels like really we should still be considering more of that, the tool that actually already exists in state government, Susanna Davis's tool, which is like the back end tool of, you know, that once we have strategies or policies in place, considering their impacts. But no, we haven't talked about it in any great detail at the subcommittee level, the implications of that bill specifically.
Joey, it could actually be that the principles that you guys will be seeing soon will might actually help inform the bill as opposed to the other way around, because it's pretty, you'll see them, they're pretty comprehensive. Yes, I think they should be able to mesh just fine. And just while I've got while I've got my mute button off, just briefly, one of the things that I've been kind of bird dogging on all this as far as the among the principles is that whatever we come up with actually it has to actually be implementable. And looking at, you know, everything from the household, you know, the individual level to the household level to the community level, and you know, wearing my municipal interest hat, I would also say, you know, at the governmental level too, because we have a habit sometimes of handing things off to entities in the state that can't actually do what they're supposed to do, and that's normal. I mean, that's sometimes people just don't understand the limitations of capacity. But when everybody gets to principles one, I hope everybody will comment on. I think the folk have been working on the draft have done a great job kind of pulling the jargon out and putting it in just kind of plain English. I don't know if Kelly agrees with that, but we really wanted to make it accessible to anybody who reads it. But I hope everybody will give it a good look and, you know, really think about, you know, how they can be applied, because it sets a pretty high bar for establishing, you know, how to actually achieve a just transition. The other piece of this too is I think it's going to be real important for us to have candor, especially once we begin the public engagement. Again, just kind of from my lived experience in coal country, and then like with tobacco communities where they, you know, there was a whole transition out of that. It wasn't particularly just, it was good for owners and other folk, but not necessarily labor and others. One of the things I hope we'll be real candid about is what the impacts are and how they're likely to be felt. 'Cause I know there's a lot of opportunity. I know that I'm sure we'll be talking about things like, for folk who'll be impacted. Yes, there will be job opportunities, there will be retraining opportunities, but it's not like that's some kind of magic. So I hope everybody, what you see, the principals will really be thinking about how do we actually achieve just transitions for those frontline communities that people are going to be impacted the most, helping them both take advantage of the opportunities, but also making sure that they're not bearing like a disproportionate burden. And we're not just magically saying, yes, we'll just train everybody and you'll find gainful employment and self-actualization and everything will be okay. Because that's not magical like that. It doesn't work that way. And just growing up where I grew up in coal country, decades, everybody saying we're going to retrain you and have you do something else and, work on other development so that you'll come out at the end of this, even stronger than you were before. And that never really happened because the emphasis was on the mine owners and other folk, not necessarily the people working in the mines and the larger communities. So anyway, but I like where we're at, and have had a lot of deliberation, a lot of hard deliberation. So you'll be seeing them soon.
Thank you, Just Transitions. We obviously, that went on a bit longer than we had bargained for, but those were great updates. Thank you all. So maybe we can do a quick around the horn with our task leads. Let's start with Joey and Gina in transportation. We can try to be succinct and get us a little bit back on schedule.
Yes, we can be brief. Jane's gonna, I think, drop in the chat like who is in the task lead conversation, but from, just so you know, Lauren from the transportation task group, Gina and I don't see anyone else. Ken Jones has been pulled in, and Dan Dutcher joins us, and Deirdre a little bit, poor Deirdre. We have been having informal weekly meetings with a much broader group of other transportation / land use related experts. And we are just, last week we heard from Dave Roberts of Drive Electric Vermont, just with an update. Folks know that there's pretty significant infusion of new dollars into various programs, including vehicle electrification programs, Mileage Smart and others. So we've got sort of a status report from him, and are looking at just continuing to look at the broad suite of strategies. We're not wanting to get out too far in front of the process, but really just to bring this crew up to speed on lay of the land, and then bucket out those different strategies, which are very broad: transportation demand management, the land use smart growth strategies, and everything else. So it's really just been a learning exercise. Gina, what else would you share?
Well, we look forward to the briefing from Jane on the template, because we're going to run and we probably will be able to do it by the next meeting. We're going to run our strategies through that template and review it with our committee. So yeah, I think we've got like 22 items on our list at this point, which are still pretty big buckets. So those are our next big steps.
Thank you, Gina. Yes, I'm very much looking forward to that. Thank you so much for sharing that draft assessment tool. And maybe in service of answering Lauren's question, just so there's clarity for us and others, I can lay out here who the sort of council subcommittee members and other staffers who've been participating in our conversation are, and maybe other task group leads could do the same.
Well, I think Jane is going to circulate a list. It'd be a little more efficient. No,
doesn't seem to be that there is one. So I'm saying we create it now.
There isn't one. That's nice. I know.
Okay.
I mean, I know who the task leads are, but I just assumed that there was something that you produced as part of the subcommittee that I would have found on the website, but I don't see it there.
Okay.
Well, I'm just going to drop in names here.
Go ahead, Joey. In the interest of speed, maybe just put them in the chat.
Right.
Okay, Christine, can you give us a report on buildings? She was on the call. Well, maybe we should skip that. Come back to it if she rejoins us. Ed and Liz.
Yeah, I'd say this is, it's been a little bit somewhat convoluted just because of the CEP discussions that we're sort of concurrently having, and I have not been specifically targeting some of the lists that Liz and I presented a few weeks ago now. And yeah, bottom line is I need to make a little bit more effort to have concerted conversations about that specific list instead of trying to tackle everything with the CEP. So, and I know Liz has had a couple separate conversations. Basically, we talked to too many people without as much targeted as we should be at this point.
Yeah, we need to compare some notes and then circle back. But I think we're on a pretty good path to do some of that in the first couple weeks of June. I think we're targeted toward the end of the month, if I remember, Richard. So that's probably good for that reason.
That's right. You're on the schedule for, I think, June 24. Peter, anything from you?
Right. The non-energy group is moving right along. I would say with the one sort of conversation we had that was really impactful last Friday was about where the ag and eco subcommittee is with their development of mitigation strategies that will then feed to us. So I want to be clear with all of you that we won't have those strategies to review when we present the rest of our concepts in the coming, it went on the 10th. That is the goal. We're not going to get there, and they're not going to get there. And if they're having a really robust conversation right now about moving those along, and I didn't want to impact that process. So we'll incorporate that work when it's ready, but just wanted to make sure everybody was aware that you're not going to see those at our next meeting.
Got it. But at the next meeting, the other sectors that you've been paying attention to, you'll report on?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I think since we haven't heard from buildings, I think we're done on the roundup now. I can get back to the rest of the committee meeting business. So Jane, back to you.
I don't have the agenda open. Is this council updates?
Council
updates on the
updates.
agenda?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So this can be brief. This has a lot on the agenda, so hopefully we can play catch up a little bit. But there was a council meeting on Monday of this week. There were sort of, for folks who weren't there, there were 4 major themes that we spoke to. We spoke to the council's continuing commitment to equity. And there are a number of touch points there that I can speak to if folks would like. We had an update on public engagement and where we are with respect to the rollout of the phase 1 component of the public engagement and the timeline around public engagement plan development. We spoke to the state's investment in climate work with respect to how it put money and dollars forward in the budget this year. And then we had an in-depth conversation about the milestones ahead of us with respect to how the subcommittee work will respond to those milestones over the coming months. So based on that, some of the takeaways that we heard and CBI and I have processed since then is sort of a commitment to guiding and putting forward a process for how we're, and like who's on first for responsibilities of how we're going to build up into a climate action plan. So what the engineering of the climate action plan will look like. And I can start to talk about that later today on the agenda when we talk about a little bit about work planning, because we've had some conversations there. We've also had a sort of heard loud and clear, especially from some subcommittees more than others, around just capacity to actually bring to bear on putting forward writing for the climate action plan. So that again speaks to who's doing what and who's responsible for what. And then, yeah, why don't I just pause there? My only other note that I had made about updates was really about science and data, which Jared already updated around his new roles and responsibility there as co-chair. So the council meeting, it felt really productive. And I will say that I think that was sort of one of our last meetings as a council. And I know this will be music to some folks' ears around like thinking high level. I think here on out, we're going to really start getting into the meat of the work needed to draft the climate action plan at a council level to some degree. And that will really shift in earnest at the end of the summer, where if you didn't catch note of it in my milestones, I've proposed, and nobody's kicked me out yet, that the council will need to meet bi-weekly starting in September to get us to a deliverable of December 1st for the climate action plan.
Jane, can you say a word about the status of the technical consulting contracts?
Sure, I mentioned this earlier, but we have a draft contract. It's ready. It's with our attorney for review and business office now. And I'm excited. We went back to, I should just say for all of you, and this would be really pertinent, I think, for all of you, is the proposal that we picked to move forward with contract negotiations around was the lowest in cost by far of the 4 proposals that we received. And it lowest in that it might have even given us pause that perhaps they didn't understand what we were asking, but the consultants came with glowing recommendations from our review team, as well as other states that we reached out to. And, you know, they have a lot of experience in actually doing technical analyses for state climate action plans, which was one of our priorities to ensure that we got through the consultants that we brought on board. And so since they were the lowest, we could go back to them and sort of say, can you put buffer and headspace into all of these components of work so that they'd still be the cheapest proposal, but they'd have buffer so that as you all come up with questions or we find gaps in their capacity to think at a level that we need to think in certain sectors, we can ask them to reconsider things, and we'll have some buffer in the contract, hopefully, to do that. That was really apparent with the carbon budget component of the proposal, but since then, Gina and Joey and I have met and talked about perhaps the proposal lacking systems thinking for transportation and the expertise being too specific. So hopefully there'll be capacity there to bring on other folks to help think about that space of work. But that's our intent, is to ensure that we have flexibility to work with them to provide the capacity that we need for the on the time frame that we have. One of the distinctions, just maybe for everybody's benefit, that I suspect will happen is I suspect we won't do REMI for the economic modeling. I suspect that we're going to use a different program called IMPLAN, which Jared could speak to in much more detail than me, but everybody has felt like, based on the time frame that we have and the REMI is only as good as the specifics you put into REMI, and we don't feel like perhaps we're going to have the time to get out of REMI what it's capable of doing for this round. And we also have Ken Jones, yeah, he's on the call, who said that he can do some REMI analysis for us as well along the way.
Thanks, Jane.
Chris, do you have a question about what I just spoke to? Or is that an old hand?
Old hand, sorry about that. I'll get rid of it.
Okay, any other reports concerning the council as a whole? Peter, Jane? Anybody else?
No, other than to say that Dr. Panikar's presentation was really, really good, and I would encourage anybody who wasn't on the meeting to watch the YouTube video of it. It was just a powerful presentation and powerful discussion. So,
thanks, Peter. All right, we're a little bit ahead of schedule at the moment, but we could take some time to receive public comment on any of the topics that have come up so far this morning? I'm not sure I can see all the hands, so Peter or Jane, you may have to help me if someone wishes to speak.
I don't see anybody yet. If you like to comment, please either raise your hand or come off mute and speak. So Donna, please go.
Donna. Yeah.
Hi, I tuned in a little bit late, but since there was no buildings related information shared in this morning's meeting, but I did see that Gina Campoli had a message about who they were sharing information and ideas with. I just wanted to request that since AIA Vermont has been, submitting ideas on a fairly constant basis to the committee about building related program ideas, that that we be included in whatever information is coming out. Just as an FYI, Vermont Gas has come to AIA Vermont, the Committee on the Environment, to ask architects to help them locate customers who can participate in a pilot program related to installing geothermal heat pumps. Well, actually, the geothermal side of the heat pumps. I guess the heat pump, they're willing to do financing. So they're being very innovative about that, and they realize that architects have a big role in this. So I'd hope that the Climate Council would kind of acknowledge that more than they have been. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. I think it's, as you said, we should reach out to you in terms of sharing information with you, but also it should be bi-directional. We're looking for information.
Well, we are. We are. I mean,
I know you are, and I'm encouraging that and acknowledging that, and I will pass that on to the buildings team.
Yeah, just can I offer one comment about related to Green Mountain Power's role? As some of you know, I am heavily involved in lighting design, and street lighting is a piece of that. And there seems to be this attitude in Vermont that wireless communication systems and networks done through utility poles and streetlights, that's this futuristic thing. But in fact, utilities all over the country are doing this already. And one of the things that can be accomplished with these wireless systems is to be able to put in meters to monitor, meters to incorporate electric recharging stations. Basically be provided at any utility pole that has a street light on it. And I've tried calling GMP, and it's like, oh, it's not in our plans, and just kind of wanted to put it out there. If you want people to be able to recharge cars, you got to provide places where they can do it. And you might not get as much private financing for some of this, but the utilities have a lot to gain from having recharging stations located in everywhere. And that's why utility or streetlights become such an important mode, because they are literally everywhere. So just offering that, and hope that makes your list, because that's a pretty easy one to do. Just takes money.
Thank you for that idea, Don.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? All right.
I'll just note, Rich, that I just saw, sorry, belatedly, a message from Christine that she is on, but she's having trouble unmuting. She tried the *6. So I don't know if anybody knows a different way for folks joining by phone unmute other than *6, but just so folks know, Christine is able to listen in, but unfortunately she's not able to give the update given the phone issue with Zoom right now.
Yesterday when I joined Science and Data early on my phone, if I connected with internet audio, it was the only way you all could hear me. When I called in with my phone number, it didn't work. So if you choose, rather than connect with a phone, connect with your internet audio, it worked for me yesterday.
Christine may be in transit, so may not be able to do that. I'm not sure.
All right, thanks for the report, Jared. And thanks to everybody for the first half of our meeting. I think it's time to take a break, and let's reconvene at 12 after, or 10 after 12. And work, at that point, we'll work through the policy template and work planning.
Rich, can you hear me?
I can. Oh, look at that.
This is Christine. Would you like a buildings report now or?
I'd love it now that you're here. That's great.
I apologize for. I'm having a lot of interconnectivity issues that I haven't had in this location before, so my apologies. Jared, can you thumbs up if you can hear me? Yeah, I'm going to type my remarks into the chat because I don't think I have reliable connection. I don't want to waste people's time.
All right. Thanks, Christine. You are fading in and out a bit.
Yeah, sorry, my apologies. I'll write it in the chat.
Thank you. All right, let's take our break until 10 after the hour. Thanks, everybody. Christine, I suspect that's you that I can hear typing. So that's a sign that, in fact, your audio is working.
No, it was me. I forgot to mute.
Whoops, that's fine. I was just hoping that Christine's audio was going to come on for the second half.
Can you hear me reliably now?
Yep, that sentence came through straight.
Okay, I really don't know what's going on, so I'm going to focus on writing in the chat because I don't want to waste people's time.
Yeah, I think that's fine, Christine. Thank you.
Yep.
looks like we're getting a bit of the committee back. Peter and Jane, are you ready to pick it back up?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, just opening up the spreadsheet quick.
All right. Thank you. You're on.
All right, I was part of our last discussion. We've been talking about how to apply our ideas to a template that will assist with evaluation and review. Ultimately, we think there are probably multiple forms of presentation for the proposals, but starting with a spreadsheet that captures all of the various pieces and information that we would like to have at some point during the review process. Kind of, we don't have them yet. Maybe in all contexts, if it's the technical consultants we're waiting on or what have you. But with the idea of starting to get layout, the information we'll need, and then sort of the status of what we've got to this point. So I sent around this morning to all of you that kind of concept spreadsheet and template, and I believe it is posted to the website as well for those following along at home who would like to look at it. I'm happy to share my screen now and just kind of walk you through what we're thinking and answer questions and work on refinements as we go. So this is with the idea of being this is how we would submit all of our policy recommendations to the group for review at our next couple of meetings, and then for further discussion and ultimate proposal to the Climate Council as a whole. So with that, once my dog leaves me alone for a moment, I will pull that up.
I can share that too, Peter. And maybe just a little bit of context about how we've already discussed this a little bit with the subcommittee and where we are at, and just recognize that Catherine and I, sorry, I was just reading Christine's comment in the chat. Catherine and I brought forward a template to the last meeting of this subcommittee, and there was a suite of you who offered to work with us to make revisions to that template to bring forward again today. And so some of you, thankfully, have helped us think about this in the context of how it is both applicable to this subcommittee, but could be replicated with modifications for the 3 subcommittees that are responsible for putting forward strategies ultimately for the climate action plan. So you'll see tabs on the bottom that think about cross-sector mitigation, rural resilience and adaptation, ag and ecosystems, and recognizing that there is benefit of having consistency around this like summation of strategies that come up and to be vetted by the council ultimately, and then first and foremost go out for public engagement. So we're hoping that through that we can sort of make minor tweaks that are more relevant to each of these subcommittees, but that there could be consistency here on one metric, one tool that is used at this level for these for the development of strategies at this scale. And then I'll just suggest, as Peter already alluded to, there will be other templates coming. And so I think that the clear, obvious, next step is how do we take this Excel spreadsheet and make it communicable to the public? And so I suspect at the same time that you're thinking about this Excel spreadsheet, you'll also be thinking about a PowerPoint presentation. And that's on me with input from Climate Access and RISE to put together a slide deck to share with you. And I'd expect that will be ready to share with you at your next meeting within the next 2 weeks, knowing that that we'll want to communicate the strategies coming out of the subcommittees in an efficient and clear way with the public, and that is one way of doing that. So that's also coming. And then ultimately, I also see the need for a Word template that is sort of where I think the subcommittee will sort of take your work to, which is that you'll have these Excel spreadsheets, but then there'll be some responsibility at the subcommittee level of boiling that up into summaries in a Word document for the key strategies that you're pushing forward through the council. So, and then the responsibilities ultimately to staff to knit together the climate action plan with input from all the subcommittees at that level. But what in reflection about all of this and thinking about the work of the subcommittees, it's a really heavy lift, I think, right now. There'll be these key moments for the subcommittees where there'll be a lot of work. And I think this is one of them, like between now and July, to get to a place where we have the full suite of strategies that we want to test with the public. And then again, I think in the fall, as we start to incorporate that engagement, cost considerations, and then think about the implementation of these strategies and recommendations. So thanks for pulling it up, Peter. And just thank you for Catherine for helping us think through the comments that we heard with the group that came together earlier this week to think about this.
Can everybody can see the spreadsheet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
And that I'm never quite sure with screen sharing, but okay. So the basic concept of this was to try to capture what proposals we were going to put forward, what we knew about them in terms of relative what the strategy was, what it was relating to in terms of an overall goal or requirement piece, and then sort of some primarily qualitative estimates at this point, given that we don't have, our technical consultants having reviewed these in terms of their potential, but to really do it in a way that built on, that could build from there into kind of test the things that we needed from the consultants. So we put in an example of the from the transportation sector just as a way to think through it. This is very much a light touch at this point, and does not have enough information in it. But the basic idea was thinking through. So if you think about, sort of all of these these concepts relate to the transportation sector. So, we have them all kind of blocked together as you do your task lead work. This specific pathway that we borrowed from EAN's analysis, and this is a kind of topic of conversation that we'll want to have here in a moment about sort of, do we want to start with those pathways that Jared and team have identified that we've heard about for a while now as a sort of starting point for some of those, that piece. It makes sense and works in this context, so we just included it here for kind of pre-discussion activity. So we put in sort of in terms of that electrification of transportation, one of the pieces is to have 47,000 electric vehicles on the road by 2025. And then that relates to 120,000 by 2030. And then the template gets into what are the specific strategies that we want to use to get there, and since all of these add up together to create the movement towards the pathway, we didn't want to have them be separated out, because then you start getting into kind of some complicated math where you can't necessarily attribute individual pieces to an incentive versus the installation of a charging network. We know that it's all part of the whole effort. And then once, so what is the strategy? What is the estimated timeline to implement? Are we building on an existing program? Are we creating something new? What are the sort of the factors at play there? Getting into column H, the relative prioritization piece. I think what I had envisioned here is, as Lauren mentioned, the multi-factor criteria assessment tool that they've been using, this might be a place to input that information from if we were to use something like that. Sort of what do we know about the relative ranking of this in terms of its impact? And then you get into the sort of what are the specific greenhouse gas emissions reductions we're expecting by 2025? How does this relate to the just transitions guiding principles? When we've done something of an equity impact assessment, what are we seeing? What are the factors we ought to be considering? Impact is a little bit of one we need to work on to define a little bit better. That could mean a number of things, and we recognize that that's an incomplete step at this point. Getting into feasibility, what are the barriers at play? What do we need to be addressing? How do we get to an effective strategy of getting to that result? What do we need to accomplish? What are some of the precursor steps, et cetera? And then, sort of getting into the cost estimates. What's the investment needed? We're anticipating at this point sort of a high, medium, low sort of piece, and we'll define that a little bit better for folks. And then looking out to 2030, kind of what else are we expecting? We may not have that information at this point. We wanted to make sure it was included because there are a lot of strategies that are primarily focused in the longer term, as Gina mentioned. The sort of land use planning piece is not a quick turn sort of proposal. It's a setting us up for success in the long term. And then what are the other considerations that we should be factoring in? Who's going to implement, who's the likely implementer or options that might exist? And then who are the key stakeholders in that process that we need to make sure that we're engaging? Ideally, we'll then add columns to this that will get into more of the sort of quantitative factors that we'll get in work with the technical consultants, or we'll update these columns to be more precise as we get more information and do more analysis on these specific proposals. But none of the information in here should really come as a terrible surprise. This is obviously the things we've been discussing throughout, trying to make sure that they're equitable and implementable and feasible along the way, trying to understand what's most cost effective, all of those factors that come into play so that we can start to build this out. So we just wanted to get your feedback and thoughts on this as a starting point so that we can further build it out from here.
Peter, could you scroll the scroll bar over so we could see the final columns?
Nope, sorry, did you not see this? That's it.
Oh, is the last column? Okay.
No, R is. Can you guys not see R now?
Yeah, you can't see it all. You can't see it all right now for some reason, Peter.
That's odd.
I see the O.
There's a scroll bar underneath.
No, I've scrolled. I can see it. That's for some reason.
Okay.
There's a P, a Q, and an R. There's an other kind of, what are the other implementation considerations? Whether there's statutory language needed or whatever else to do it. And then you get into the sort of who's doing the implementation and who are the key stakeholders involved in the process. So those are what the final columns are.
I have a couple of comments, and if others have comments, raise your hands. I quite like this. And I have a couple of comments. One on the equity assessment or list of positive and negative impacts. Maybe it's implicit there, but it seems to me that, a naked policy may have positive and negative impacts of a certain type, but a fully fleshed out policy with targeting built into it, for example, or low-income assistance built into it, might not have those same impacts. That certainly we would intend the full design to moderate equity impacts. So I guess we should specify in that list of positive and negative impacts, right alongside that or embedded in it would be program elements that enhance equity.
I mean, I would largely phrase it as a, they're without a full set of factors that would allow us to account for some of the equity concerns. There could be equity concerns based on these factors. And so this is what we should incorporate into the long-term strategy to address those. That sort of statement, I think, would be really useful in this context.
Yeah, the heading could be adjusted or a different column could be added, in order to really make that plain to people. A different issue that we've discussed in prior meetings that might be included in one of your PQ and R columns, it is an assessment of which program elements do we think could be advanced more quickly and recommended, for example, for either rulemaking or legislative action in the next year, versus which ones do we think are going to require a lot longer program design, political debate, what have you, before they can be implemented. So we've talked about this under sometimes using the phrase "no regrets" strategies, the things we know we could do, we could act on really quickly. Jared likes to call them win-win solutions, or there may be other terms for them, but I'd recommend that we have a place in our assessment to pick out the early action items that we would prioritize for legislative or administrative action. Okay, I see a bunch of hands up.
So I think one way to do that is just simply adding a column before G that sort of had a yes, no, ready to implement. Right. And now.
Yeah, something like that.
And then we can, that will be a ready trigger, right? And so we can sort of see that. But then the timeline, to me, the estimated timeline is sort of built upon that and adds some depth that says, okay, if it's not an existing program, what's the runway to get it going? And that could include all of both the logistics hurdles and the kind of political factors at play.
Good, thank you. So I've got Joey, Kelly, Jared, and Ed in that order.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jane, Peter, whomever put this together. Seems like a really good foundation on which to build. Definitely want to sit with a little bit more and think about it in terms of the different strategies. A couple of things. One, and these are all just very random. One thing I think about is, just in general, and what we're talking about doing here too, is like transitioning our entire sort of global civil society away from fossil fuels and into more clean, healthy, renewable, efficient alternatives. So it's a big lift, and it's going to have costs and consequences. And some of us have been more complicit in that. And I'm trying to think about like how we think about business as usual, and I don't know what that means, but I'm just thinking about it. I'd also just say that thinking about sort of like conservation and other kinds of strategies, wondering where they may show up and how to measure them in this kind of an assessment. I'm not very well familiar with the multi-criteria assessment that Lauren shared. I do wonder about too many assessments. I want to think about how, like, what are the assessments that we need in service of the statute, so I want to look into that a little bit more and understand that more. And I think maybe I'd bear the benefit of a broader conversation with you, Lauren, or others who have been applying that to understand it in more detail. And then I was thinking very similarly to the point that Richard raised on, policies when it comes to sort of an equity assessment, positive, negative impacts or outcomes. I really feel like it depends on the policy design. And then, if we're talking about vehicle electrification, or for example, if you're talking about like things like the Transportation and Climate Initiative, it's insufficient and imperfect and inequitable. But like some states like Massachusetts are having accompanying policies that could go further and get at those equity issues in a much bigger, obviously critically important way. So I just want to think about broader buckets of strategies. If you break them, may not fit through the screen of the equity assessment. But if you bucket it into separate, different, distinct programs, you could potentially make them, through the program design process, make them equitably and refine what those, how they are implemented, I guess. Anyway, so that's just like a very random set of ideas. Mostly, I just want to say thank you for the work. And I think this is an important foundation, which I very much appreciate. I just want to think through some of that stuff more with you all and others.
I think I'm next.
Yeah,
Yes, so two things. Well, first of all, yeah, I agree. This looks great. You guys clearly put in a lot of work, and this looks like it'll be useful. On what Richard was saying about the equity assessment part there, I was wondering, since this is sort of an initial look at these things and not an actual policy, correct me if I'm wrong in my understanding, not supposed to be like a full-fledged policy proposal, the equity assessment column might just be like, these are potential impacts. We're flagging them. We need to consider these as we develop the policy. And if we can't mitigate those and make them comply with our just transitions goals and everything, then this can't happen or something like that. But like make this sort of like a initial flagging of issues, but not necessarily having to solve them all right here. So I don't know if that makes sense given what the other columns in this tool are meant to do. I hope that made sense, sorry. And then the other thing I was thinking is I wondered if there should be a final column that talks about 2050. I know that we can't, if we're having trouble with 2030 numbers, 2050 numbers are going to be, they're going to feel like guesses, but I think there are probably things that they may show very little for us in 2030, but could have increasing impact over time. And even things that might be very simple to do right now and inexpensive to start that could grow into a big impact. And so I wouldn't want to lose sight of the long-term thinking, because short-term thinking is how we got in this place where we are. And I know everyone wants to fix it as fast as possible, but I think we're going to need to start to also incorporate long-term thinking into our solutions as well. So those are my two thoughts.
thanks, Kelly.
Kelly, I really appreciate that. I'm going to add a column that says sort of qualitative description on impact on 2050, right? Sort of like we're not going to say how many electric vehicles we need, but we know it's going to be a huge part of what our transportation sector looks like. That would allow for things like land use planning and smart growth to have a heavier, be more clearly defined as an important role because of their impact on the long term. That
Yeah,
makes
you
sense.
might even be able to do like a low, medium, high kind of thing. You know, if we, not to get super granular, but just to see like, oh, this doesn't look like it's super impactful, but then to realize that if we think a little bit farther out, it may be worth doing. Like planting a tree, you're like, but I'm not going to have fruit next year. Yeah, but in 4 years or 5 years or 6 years, you know, and you will, and you'll be glad that you planted it today.
Yep, I like that a lot. Thank you.
Jared?
Thanks, Rich. So a couple of thoughts. One is I'm appreciating having more time with this because I'm now seeing it again, thinking of things that I didn't think of initially. One is, in reference to, there's a couple of reference points I'm trying to keep in mind. One is the statute. One is the kind of outline for the plan that's been presented with the council. And another is kind of, how we're tracking these in relation to the inventory and some of the categories in the greenhouse gas inventory. And so one thing I have Secretary Young's words echoing in my mind in terms of the importance really clearly and throughout the GWSA of the language around the largest greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the most cost-effective manner. And I understand that like right now we may not be able to do an assessment on cost effectiveness of different strategies. But I do think it would be worth, even if we're just kind of having it as a placeholder, because we know that our consultants are going to be doing the mitigation supply curves, which will give us, a kind of cost per ton avoided, figures of certain approaches. I think that would be a good placeholder column to put in. And maybe in the short term, we're just kind of doing our initial sense of cost effectiveness that could be based on the PSD's cost of carbon model or the existing literature. I don't think it needs to be filled in with perfect detail yet, but I wouldn't want to lose track of it. And I think we're going to want that there in the end. A couple of other thoughts is that impact column L, I'm not entirely sure what that's getting at. In terms of aligning it with what we've asked our consultants for, they are going to be producing assessments related to an economic assessment, both at the microeconomic and macroeconomic level. There'll be a health assessment. And so I wonder if we either say what we really mean by impact is, I could be wrong, but I'm assuming that is some of those other assessments that we have baked in. There was also an environmental assessment about kind of co-benefits or other things related to these strategies. Or do we kind of get rid of the impact column and just have more, add some columns with more detail that is like, in addition to equity considerations, it's like economic, health, environmental, because that's the data that's going to be coming back to us in detail. And maybe in the meantime, it is just kind of general or directional of what we're saying. I am trying to think. I would just say to Kelly's point about 2050, when we did over a 6-month period the creation and then the broad review process for the emissions reduction pathways analysis, we did include numbers for 2050. We just have I think there's a much higher degree of uncertainty and a lot less confidence about those because of how technologies, markets, culture are changing. So like, we have a lot more confidence in the 2025 and 2030 numbers because we have but if they were help, I agree that it should really just be directional at this point and that those numbers are just kind of plugged in to make things add up, but they're anybody's guess. I mean, there's so many things we don't know about the next 10 years, let alone the next 30, that would really impact a lot of these pathways from, autonomous vehicles to bidirectional charging to on-demand microtransit to hydrogen to, on and on and on. So I think that's it for me right now.
So, Peter, I like what you're doing with I assume that you acting on template. And I would ask you to include somewhere something, and maybe it's implicit in cost and funding needs, but cost per ton avoided is a really useful metric for a lot of the policies that we might be comparing. And I realize that can be embedded in some of these other places, but under economic impact, for example. But we have to look at net cost per ton avoided. I'm particularly sensitive to this as someone who's been advocating for utility energy efficiency programs for a long time, and frequently being asked, well, what does it cost? And realizing that what it saves is maybe greater than what it costs. And therefore the cost per ton avoided in that instance is, from the point of view of the Vermont power system, is actually negative. And that's just an example of the kind of thinking that we may have to engage in. And which the cost, the McKinsey cost curves, for example, routinely take that into account. Sorry, I got off track here. Ed, you're next.
Thanks. Richie just talked about cost per ton, but I would also say cost generally we need to look at, is it first year cost of a program, total cost for whatever widget, things like that. So some common definitions around cost, I think, still need to be developed. Ideally, we come up with a cost per ton, recognizing that might take, as Jared pointed out, that might take a little bit more time to get there. And then to the point that I believe Kelly made earlier as well, is even if we have a cost per ton, some of the technologies are still relatively nascent. I'm thinking in particular, for example, like electric buses don't look particularly cost effective at this moment, and we need them and we expect costs to come down. So some sort of metric recognizing how far along on sort of a technology curve we are with specific strategies, I think would also be very helpful.
Thanks, Ed. Anything more?
Nope,
Gina,
that's it.
Gina and then Christine.
Better unmute. My husband decided to mow the lawn and he stopped, thankfully. First of all, I'm really thankful that there's going to be a Word document that's going to go along with this, because there's going to be a ton of stuff, mostly I think questions for the consultants that are going to help inform what these various strategies are. So we can put a label on something right now, but we're going to need a narrative that includes questions and also information that we want to vet with the public. Because what I don't see here is how the public view, both stakeholders and the general public and all the communities we're trying to work with, how we affect this this table with that information. Maybe it's in the narrative and how we present it. These are just a bunch of ideas we came up with. They're really general. We want to hear from you about what you think. I agree that we have to deal with economics, as Jared said, the indirect and direct economics. If maybe that's what you're talking about in here. I guess you've already written it, Peter, so that's all set. And I like the idea of looking at those health, environmental, and in sustainability co-benefits when we analyze. And then for the long term, I don't want anyone to think that this is something we're going to start later. This is something we need to start now, but we'll reap the benefits further on down the road. And this is particularly true with VMT reduction strategies, such as rail and transit and smart growth. We got to keep doing it. We got to keep doing it now. We got to build it. But then I'm assuming those impacts will be garnered down the road. And I guess that's it for my notes at this point. But I think for me, I'm going to be able to evaluate this once I start using it and start putting a narrative together and filling in the boxes. It's hard for me to think about this outside of actual exercise of using it.
Yep, and I think that was the value we saw a lot in starting this. So appreciate those thoughts. I think this is not going to include every piece of information that we have gathered around a certain topic. There's just that would be too much for a spreadsheet. But certainly, as we're thinking about sort of what ultimately gets included in the report, it would factor in that sort of what did we hear from the public around refining concepts to get to a better spot from a equity or other standpoint. I think that's a really key factor to capture. I'm just not sure it would be ungainly here.
Right. Well, I think we should do what someone suggested, which we're initially flagging these ideas, the equity issues, for instance,
yeah.
And then we're verifying them, ground truthing them through our public involvement.
I apologize.
And the same would be true for any of the technical analysis. We may have some idea, can use EAN's numbers, that's great, but we want our consultants to really do the groundwork to give us more accurate information if it exists.
Yep. Appreciate all of those thoughts. I think so. I've been adding in things as we go. I apologize. The reason why you couldn't see me scrolling was because somehow I had paused sharing, and so you guys were seeing a static view. But like the importance to 2050 piece that Kelly raised, whether it's ready to go now. I changed the equity assessment to equity considerations. So does the strategy create potential equity concerns, and how might they be mitigated? Just as a kind of narrative description for that, which I think will help kind of flag the concerns that we all have and help to have that discussion, since we're not quite ready for it immediately. Or we don't know what the full policy is going to look like to be able to fully evaluate it.
Thanks, Peter.
Jane, at this point, I might propose to cut the impact column just because it's so vague and undefined.
Well, and you've added in all the new columns that you just added, different kinds of impacts.
Yeah, and I think those. I guess here's a question for you then, for everybody. The specifics of this analysis is the sort of thing that we're going to get from our contracted support, but it might be a place to, so I don't want people to spend a lot of time in this realm, because it's going to be in our best professional judgment, not a actual modeled out analysis. And so we won't necessarily get those things in the qualitative piece. We could create a sort of qualitative narrative description of potential, impacts that we think might be born out of the full analysis. Up to you all. I don't want to lose that that sort of description of like this has significant public health co-benefits, or it in other contexts has been those sorts of impacts, right? So maybe that's how we use that impact column, is a narrative description of potential co-benefit other pieces. I can only see a few of you, so somebody can speak. That would be useful.
So my take on it, Peter, is that the orange columns that you've added, different kinds of impacts, it could be an invitation to us simply to put in that narrative just in across those 5 columns, as opposed to trying to put them all under the first yellow column that you'd created. I don't really care which way we do it, but I do get it that the technical consultants are going to be filling in the orange columns for us after they do a lot more analysis. But we could initially just qualitatively put language in the orange columns. I don't really have a strong opinion which way, but I do think that the task leads should be asked to comment qualitatively on the items listed in the orange columns.
That is largely what we tried to do with the yellow. So maybe it's more matching those up and seeing where the gaps are, so that the yellow could really be where we're working currently to try to flesh some of the ideas out and provide some of that narrative description piece. And then the orange would be the sort of the actual modeled analysis. So we didn't muddy those waters.
Any other comments?
Yeah.
On Jim?
I feel strongly, Peter, that this feels a little unwieldy to me at this point, I'll say. And not recognizing that I know we have to get to some more detail, but I think that figuring out what we're missing in that qualitative impact and some of the components that you've outlined here in this analysis forthcoming, fitting that into the yellow space, and then thinking about what the further analysis is that's coming, which brings you to the other spreadsheet that talks about the quantification components, which is in getting at the technical analysis for later. So sort of making sure that we have the columns right and the qualitative impacts, and then making sure that we have the analysis accurately reflected on that spreadsheet that's sort of like to be determined later with the information from the technical analysis there. So, but I hear you on where the gaps are right now here and things that we should be thinking about, but like, I'd like to play around with how we make this speak to each other a little better.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. This is a rough cut. We should definitely make sure we refine it to match. But I think Jane, I think you and Richard and I are sort of largely in agreement that we need to be able to define in a narrative fashion what we know now or what we think now to then be tested through the analysis.
I guess, and Christine patiently had her hand up from the last conversation, so I want to let her speak, but while I have the floor, I'll just make a finer point on a comment that you made earlier in your presentation of this, Peter, which is the idea of populating this spreadsheet with EAN pathways. And would that be something that task leads would be supportive of having as a first cut to sort of work off of in your spreadsheet?
Any other comments on this? Liz, a minute ago, I saw your hand up, but did you deal with it in the chat?
Yeah, I decided to be more efficient.
Okay. Anything further on this? Christine, your hand is still up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Most of my comments have already been addressed, so thank you. Just on column P, cost and funding needs, I just hope before we start using this, we're clear on whether that's total cost or total funding needs as opposed to annual. And I would suggest that the high, medium, and low might be a couple of orders of magnitude too low. Some of the stuff is going to cost tens and tens of millions of dollars. So I would suggest we define the high as a larger number than 1 million and scale the rest down similarly. Those would be my comments for now.
Yeah, that was like me just throwing in some numbers early on just to start to get a scale, but yeah, totally agree with you, Christine, on that.
Okay, any other comments from committee members about this?
Rich, just really quickly, I appreciate Christine's comment, and also just would, to what Peter's asking, just is speaking more broadly to like how we're gonna assess the cost and funding needs. I also, and maybe we get into a level of detail more, or think about it more, like there's a difference between like the private capital and public capital potentially needed. And so I just want to be able to think about that when we're thinking about the different strategies. And, ultimately what we're trying to do is like, people are spending a significant amount of money for energy right now. And like, how do we, what are the incentives and what are the like public funding needs? And then how do we help harness private capital in this market as an opportunity?
Thanks, Joey. I find myself thinking that we're going to figure out what some of these things mean by trying to fill it out, comment that's been made earlier, and I'm inclined, with all the comments taken on board so far, to suggest that Jane and Peter, who have this well in hand, just take the revisions and create a template that you can circulate to the task leads, and then we'll just struggle through it with our initial ideas and probably make suggested modifications or fill in the categories in a way that is appropriate for whatever the subject matter is. We'll just learn by doing, I think. Somebody can correct me if you think about this differently, but I think the template is simply to force us to pay attention to a range of topics that we all agree need to be attended to, as opposed to some kind of rigid structure that we have to, jam everything into. It's really to help us with idea identification and prioritization. So use it in that way. We're going to be coming back to the committee in our next two meetings with proposals that have been put through this screen.
Yep, and we get that a solution is needed quickly, and so it may not be perfect, we may refine it, but I think we've got a strong starting point, and Jane and I will converse and figure out how to make the changes or make things lined up in the way folks have asked, and then send it out for you to start using.
All right.
Can I just say one more thing? And maybe transportation is really unique in this regard, but so much of what we're talking about, Vermont is the tail on a giant dog, a federal supply chains, the auto industry. We are going to be affected hugely by some known and some unknown actions completely outside our control. So maybe that's in the narrative. I don't know if you, we'll figure it out as we get into the table. But that's just something I've been thinking a lot about vis-a-vis what we can put down in terms of our strategies. What are the knowns and unknowns?
Yeah, really good point.
And I think transportation is unique in that regard in terms of the percentage of effect. I think the other sectors are affected by federal action, obviously, but transportation is hugely affected. Okay, that's it.
I think.
Thanks, Gina.
I have one more thing, Rich, if I may.
Please.
And I don't intend for us to address this right now, but I've been thinking about it a lot lately. At some point, we're going to need to develop or be given guidance on whether our destination is meant to be comprehensive and pretty much everything under the sun that needs to happen by 2025, 30, and 50, or whether we're trying to focus in on the biggest, most important things that have to happen most urgently because they're going to be the most cost effective on a net cost per greenhouse gas ton avoided, and be the most likely to be able to be implemented, you know, the easiest and quickly as possible. And those are not the same products, and they don't serve the same purposes. So at some point, I think we need to be clear about whether we're driving towards comprehensiveness or the biggest, most important things to get done the quickest.
That's a really excellent question. We've been, you know, kind of nudging up against that question quite a number of times. I don't know that I think the council as a whole is going to have to answer that question. I have my personal opinion about it. And I'm sure individual council members do too.
I guess I was
something that
I do think that it affects how task leads think about and should carry out their assignment now and soon, though.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it right now. I can tell you what my opinion is and what I would recommend, which is that we do focus on the topics that you mentioned as the biggest and most urgent and most implementable in the near term, those three criteria, provided that they satisfy or can be made to satisfy the just transition obligations that we also want to take on board. And that's a judgment call. But focusing on those things first, to me, makes a ton of sense. And so that's how I would prioritize our work effort. When we present something in December to the legislature, we may also include a number of other things in order to satisfy the statutory obligations. But that in terms of how I would prioritize our committee's work, it would be as along the criteria that you just mentioned. And
oh, go ahead, sorry.
I'm asking others on the committee to comment if you have a different view, or
I guess I have a different framing for that. I don't think the plan cannot include strategies that meet the requirements. And so while our initial slate of recommendations may be prioritized on those that we have most confidence in, we will need to put forward strategies that meet the requirements of the statute. That's unavoidable. And so we don't have a lot of time to not get into all of the strategies that we'll need, I guess is my concern.
Yeah. So Peter, I think you and I are saying the same thing. I was talking about prioritizing our work effort so that we can better flesh out those recommendations that we could make in December for the largest savings earliest at lowest cost as priorities that we could accelerate our thinking on, and recognizing that the statute does require us to go past that and do more than that. So I'm trying to make it clear here that I'm agreeing with you as to what the statute requires, but also suggesting that we can help the legislature and the public generally by identifying high priority action strategies as we go. And we should start out by fleshing them out, get them nailed, and then add additional strategies to the list. That's how I would organize our work.
I think I'm assuming that no matter how we go about our work, that at some point in time, there will be strategies for which there is a significant amount of passion within one or more stakeholder groups that isn't necessarily the biggest, most urgent, most cost-effective, easy to implement. And that's going to be a tricky conversation to have. So that's also what I'm trying to just think about, how that will play out moving forward. And given how that might play out moving forward, how does that inform our work now? And I think it just means we have to be really clear about what criteria we're using when we do raise a certain group of strategies to the most urgent level, so that we can point to those criteria and help explain why a certain pet idea that a certain group of stakeholders has a lot of passion about actually isn't the most urgent, the most cost effective, and the most important to be working on right now. That's really why I'm bringing this up at this point in time, because I think that's what we need to be prepared for further down the pike.
Any other comments on this? I see Jared.
Richard,
Who is that? Peter and Jared? Peter, go
sorry,
ahead.
I had to take my dog out who was urgently, desperately trying to get out. So I can't see everybody. Sorry, Jared, go ahead.
Thanks, Peter. I think just one last suggestion before we leave the template would be, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, is maybe a key down below or somewhere that lays out the definitions for the different terms. The way that I'm thinking about it is we've got sectors that basically align with the sectors identified in the greenhouse gas inventory. Then there are sectoral pathways, how you reduce emissions within those sectors that are kind of broad buckets. In the EAN emissions reduction pathways analysis, we identify those as like transportation electrification, transportation efficiency. I can share my screen, and we've basically got 3 sectoral pathways in the transportation sector and 3 in the thermal sector. And then under there are measures that or specific actions that actually reduce emissions. So we have 8 in the transportation, there are 8 in thermal and 12 in transportation. What we have not done, and what this template will need to fill in, is the strategies. And my understanding of strategies is that it includes multiple things. It can be policies and it can be programs. But the way this template is set up is identifying and fleshing out strategies, which could be policies or programs, that are designed to hit those pathways and kind of measure targets that we've laid out. And so, and I don't want to say that that is the end of the story. I mean, there is always new data emerging, new assumptions as we assess it, as we get stuff back from the LEAP model, as other folks dig into it, we might identify other measures, other pathways. But as a starting point, it at least allows us to do the math to ensure that things add up. And to the question you raised, Christine, I'd say that I think the thermal and transportation task leads are starting with a head start because there are already identified pathways and measures. Our model does not do that for electricity, ag, industry, or others. So those task groups are going to have to identify the pathways within those sectors, the measures, and the policies and programs, not just the policies and programs. But if it's okay, I'm just going to share my screen really briefly so I can make this as clear as possible. So in the pathways model, you see here are the 3 broad transportation pathways: electrification, behavioral, and efficiency in low carbon fuels. The thermal ones: electrification, weatherization, woods, and biofuels. And then within those pathways, there are all of these, I guess they're called methods here, and unit counts. And this all adds up to hitting the 2025 and 2030 targets in terms of the 74% of emissions reductions that transportation and thermal sectors are responsible for, given that they were 74% of Vermont's emissions in 2018. But again, we do not yet have pathways or methods as a starting point for those other sectors. So those task groups will have to come up with those, whereas the other ones, they can just kind of input what we've got in this model as a starting point.
Okay, thanks, Jared. Any other comments on this issue of comprehensiveness versus some kind of focused recommendations?
So I guess this is a question, and I don't know if there are other hands up. Sorry, I'm still walking my dog. The question that I have is, if we don't develop a comprehensive slate of policies, how are we going to have the contractor evaluate the cost effectiveness to be able to say whether or not they're cost effective? That's the sort of substance concerns in terms of our timeline, that if we don't lay all of them out now for evaluation, then we will not be able to have the analysis complete for inclusion in the climate action plan. And I think that is a major logistical hurdle to prioritizing only the ones that we think at this point are the most likely to be cost effective.
Peter, it's a great question. I guess my answer to that would be to suggest a form of batching, and instead of trying to do everything all at once. But I agree with you that we are required to create a comprehensive plan, number one, and number two, we want our analysts to be able to evaluate strategies. So, that would comprise that plan. So we're going to, at some point, need to give them the opportunity to do that. I just don't think it requires us to have everything on the table at the same time before they start cranking the numbers. And I say even though there's synergistic effects.
Yeah, I guess my question then is more for Jared or Jane as to what the contract is going to expect in terms of when the contractor needs to know which policies they're evaluating and whether or not they can take late comers.
The timeline is the end of the summer for that, but recognizing that it can be iterative and we're building the contract to go beyond December. So we'll actually have access to the consultants beyond the climate action plan to sort of consider some of these components that might come later.
Okay, thanks. That gives me a little more comfort. Appreciate that.
But I think as soon as the ink is dry on that contract and we can meet with them, it'll be helpful to hear from them what information they want to see in this template in terms of being able to run their analysis. So I think this is a good start, but we want to hold the opportunity that we're going to get some important feedback from them about how we present this and what level of detail we need to be prepared to try to come up with to enable that.
All right, anything further on this topic? I think, again, we're going to be on a test by test basis in the learning by doing mode. And we're going to know a lot more in a month from now than we know right now about how much detail we can develop on various proposals. The big fish and the little fish proposals. So if there isn't anything further on this topic, let's move on to the work planning part of the agenda. And let me ask Peter and Jane for your thinking about what we should be
Yeah.
talking about in this section.
Peter, do you want to kick it off, or do you want
Sure,
me to?
I'll kick it off, Jane, and then if you could share the document that CBI put together for other subcommittees, that'd be helpful. As Jane mentioned, this is our sort of near-term period of time is pretty heavy into our work, and then as the council and the public are chewing on policy considerations, we'll have time to be sort of in a work person-like fashion, making our way through some of further refinement of those ideas to get to later stages. And so these next few meetings are really going to be important for us. And I'd like to sort of lay out a concept around with you for the next 4 meetings. And then we can talk about sort of building that into a plan that we can all take a look at. The basic concept is we've talked about the next 2 meetings will be deep dives into the initial slate of recommendations. So there'll be 2 on June 10th and 2 on June 24th of the task leads. We then the major milestone we are seeking to hit has now been agreed upon by the council to be the 26th of July meeting of the council. Will be where the council deliberates on which proposals will go to the public for discussion. And so that gives us then 2 meetings, the 8th and the 22nd of July, to take the discussions we've had about those, having the task leads have taken those back, and then for us to sort of see what changes have been made and work to finalize those. I would propose on the 8th, and then on the 22nd, really work to refine how we want to build presentation to the public and to the council, and sort of work through what that presentation will look like, sort of having built those into the slide template that Jane talked about and other things, and kind of discuss how the work product that we've made will go forward to other users of that information. So the general sort of platform of timeline would be the next 2 meetings, really digging into each of the proposals from the task leads. The next meeting to take the built-in feedback and go through them again to see what changes have been made. And then working on how on the 22nd, getting ready for the full council meeting on the 26th to describe the presentation form and ways in which we'll put that forward to the group. Obviously, we'll have other things that we'll need to continue to get updates on in the work of the other subcommittees and other pieces, but just wanted to sort of put that out there as a conceptual framework.
So just building upon that, CBI, I think I stated this earlier, but in thinking about capacity for the subcommittees, the next 2 months is a heavy lift. And sort of waited, rather than having Catherine wait to be invited to participate in these meetings, we're sort of considering the role of CBI as like full on engaged for the next 2 months with all of the subcommittees and providing helpful context for process oversight. And so just thinking and sort of sharing this expectation with the subcommittee, Peter's executive assistant Renita has now scheduled, we'll have standing meetings with Catherine, myself, and Richard and Peter to sort of do some work planning in advance and try to be anticipating work and workflow for your meetings for the next 2 months. One of the tools that we were considering, and that's what Peter just had me pull up, this has not been developed yet for your subcommittee, but I think this could be a really helpful tool to think about that smaller group of us with recognition that we'd welcome other subcommittee members joining in that smaller group if you're interested in helping think about this. But Pat Fields for CBI has put this together. Ag and Ecosystems is going to review this tomorrow as a tool, but the Abby, Billy, and I worked with Pat to put together sort of a workflow at the task group level over the next 2 months, and then how that works and sinks into how subcommittee meetings are planned, what's being presented, what's being planned at the meeting, and what needs to be deliberated on in order to meet the timelines. And I know this seems sort of somewhat detailed, but I'm really feeling like this at this level for the next 2 months, we need to start to think about how we plan out the work of the consultants, the work of like knowledge, information, and then as well as how decisions and process are going to flow for the next 2 months. So in particular, and then think about how we take it beyond that. So just sort of want to hear general consensus that this is worth the investment to think about, and then offer the opportunity for other subcommittee members who are interested in helping us think about that. Happy to forward along the meeting invitation for that. And then just in thinking about work planning and roles, I'd also want to recognize that CBI will bring additional capacity, and then we're thinking about staff roles within the agency to sort of be champions for each of the subcommittees and working on how we like pull it all together into the plan. And so it'll likely be me with this subcommittee, but there'll be a dedicated staff person who will be responsible for sort of crafting the climate action plan with respect to your subcommittee's work and how it builds into the overarching plan. But all the subcommittees will be have a point person in that role in that coming week or so assigned to them, or activated up from within the staff that have already been serving on the subcommittees. So we're really trying to think about capacity and key needs for capacity for subcommittees in the coming weeks and months. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Comments or questions for Jane? Jane, I have a couple of comments. I like the work planning document that you just showed us. I think it would be helpful for each of us, each of the task groups, and for the committee as a whole, subcommittee as a whole. So we should go ahead and try to, sharpen our pencils to that degree. And when we decide to have that meeting, I'd like to invite each of the task leads to join us as we work through it, or else we do that bilaterally with the task leads, which we could do.
So can I respond to that real quick, Richard? I think that, yes, I think that while I think this has to be coordinated closely with the task leads, I don't actually think that it's not going to be specific enough about each body of work. It's going to be about milestones that they need to hit along the way. And so my recommendation in this case would be that that you and Peter as co-chairs with one or two others work with us to populate this and then put it out for digestion with
That's
plenty
fine.
of time ahead of the next meeting.
That's fine. I have a comment about staff assistance. When we were discussing earlier, populating the template with a lot of information and judgment, and then also creating a Word document that would explain what the template is summarizing. That's a lot of writing. And I doubt that the task leads are going to want to or be able to do all that, literally to do all that writing. So having staff support is going to be really helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate that. and I have felt, and I'm happy to hear pushback on this. I have felt that the templates, the Excel spreadsheet at the very least, is the responsibility of the subcommittee to fill out. I think that the writing and the narrative can come from staff support, but I'm not sure where the agency brings staff capacity to actually populate the templates. But I hope that task leads have support in their own smaller task groups to bring that capacity to bear. And if not, that's not true, then we should really be thinking about this.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think in terms of the narrative description, I think that is a step down the road anyways. That from my perspective, it wouldn't be all that useful for us to start writing about what these things are until we have the analysis in, because I think that will be framing it as well as the public input along the way. So, you know, I think the Excel spreadsheet synopsis / PowerPoint summary is probably sufficient at this point. And I think we all as test leads ought to be able to do that for the slate of recommendations we've got.
I want to say something about that. I think from how I'm viewing that spreadsheet, though, in order to understand what's in the spreadsheet, there's got to be some words behind it, maybe because transportation is a little more complicated. But I'm just afraid if we just throw something up there, people aren't going to be able to interpret it correctly. I mean, I'm prepared to just write topics that need to be further written about in some kind of narrative form by the consultant, because if the state can't do it and we volunteers can't do it, then somebody's got to do it. And I thought that's what the consultants are for. And we can, you know, come up with topics, come up with questions that need to be answered, outline a narrative. I'm going to have to do that in order to, that's maybe just the way I think, in order to fill in those boxes. It's not a lot of words, but there is some writing involved.
I hear you, Gina. The idea is that will be some opportunity to write in the spreadsheet form, right? And it's not all just a high, medium, low dollar figure. We'll flesh some of that out and provide more guidance on that in the sort of top bar. I think there's the disconnect, maybe sort of what are we producing on what timeline. In the near term, we're looking to populate the spreadsheet, which is really for our own our review of the concepts in one consistent format. The next step but it's not going to be a particularly user-friendly format for the public audience. And so we need to refine that format, and that will come in that sort of July stage of the process. But I think from my contemplation, I ought to be able to put in the words in the spreadsheet that will mostly make the creation of the PowerPoint slides pretty easy, right? Because it should most of the information should be in there.
Well, there were words to go along with the PowerPoint slides.
Right.
Explain things that are on the PowerPoint. Yeah, that will be further down the road.
So Peter, if our understanding is that at the moment, for this round, we're filling in the spreadsheet for the purposes of allowing the subcommittee to get its arms around the whole suite of likely proposals. And it's, as you said, internal to us at this point. Then it doesn't need to explain itself to the public. I think we can populate the spreadsheet ourselves. But
I think it will be useful. When we send it back out, we'll run through a more complete example that I think will answer most of the concerns, because there will be enough information in there for people to get a sense of where the questions and concerns are. And we'll make that clear. it's not, I mean, I want to be clear, it's not just for internal, it's for us to be able to get our arms around it, but it will be available and accessible to the public, and we want them to have access to it. It just won't be in the most digestible form at this point.
Okay, so if we have that in mind, obviously it's a public document, then we have in mind that the more complete explanation will come later. Maybe we'll, we can proceed without a lot of staff support. But I think I want to, on behalf of the subcommittee members, just plant a flag that we are going to need assistance in writing up these proposals for consumption by everybody, the public, the legislature, anybody who's, and for the council as a whole. So there's going to be a need for either the consultants or for agency staff to help the committee to do that. So just planting a flag there. One other question, that thorny question about where we are as we develop the proposals along the schedule that you have quite usefully sketched out. Where will we be with respect to public engagement and the Just Transitions outreach as we're doing this in June and July?
We'll be doing it under the auspices of like embarking on the public engagement plan and strategies, because that will be done the end of June. It'll be digested by the steering committee with co-chairs present, and then with the subcommittees all the week of July 12th, so that you'll be able to hear from and learn from the audience analysis that was completed and is ongoing now. And then the public engagement plan is sort of kicked off with the testing of the strategies as the first component.
Okay, but so we will be getting input from the initial listening sessions in early July that we can take on board as we do the July work. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think of July 8th and 22nd as it absorbing a lot of input and refining our ideas, and then getting them ready to present in the most effective way possible.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we would have at least the early feedback from the first listening sessions from the consultants who are doing that as we do that, as we refine the strategies.
Great.
All right. Anything further on the work plan? What's ahead of us, Jared?
If it's okay, I just want to make sure that I think I'm hearing and understanding this straight, but I want to just verbalize it and see if it aligns and is on the same page with what you're presenting, Jane. And that is that, like, really the subcommittees are coming up with the content and the recommendations that are going to be the substance of what is drafted in the plan. And so when we say, we're going to identify staff to help with the drafting of the report, that's basically putting into words the substance that has already been created and identified in these subcommittees. It's not creating something out of whole cloth or some idea that no one has heard of yet. And then that draft, which will be incredibly helpful, I think, to the council and the subcommittees, will be available for review to make sure that the subcommittees and council feel like that was, accurately captured. I feel like sometimes when we hear the word drafting, it can be open to interpretation. And my understanding is it is this very helpful step of putting into words, but working from the content and substance that is directed by and coming out of the subcommittees. And there will be an opportunity for review by the subcommittees to make sure that we feel like that was accurately capturing what those recommendations were.
thank you for that synopsis. I think that accurately reflects it.
All right. Thanks, Jared. Anything further on this topic? So I want to take a moment to thank Peter and Jane both for the template and for the more detailed work plan suggestion, and look forward to bearing down on them and working through them. And as we said earlier, learning by doing. Anything further for this meeting before we turn to public comment?
Thank you all for the feedback. It's very helpful. Obviously, there are lots of different ways to look at the template and the work plan and sort of get your feedback on what you need to see as you go through it. And I guess as we build out what the template that we share with you looks like, you will obviously continue there will be places of irritation and places of question that come up as you're filling it out. And I would say that we'll capture those ideas and make modifications as needed, but we should sort of stick with the template for now and then improve upon it as we make revisions for the 8th of July. So let's think about it that way.
And Peter, there will be places of joy.
Always places of joy. This whole thing.
Irritation. So, public comments. Any members of the public who would like to address the committee at this point?
I think Chad has a comment though too,
Yeah.
Rich, if you want to take from Chad before you go to public.
You can see the hands maybe better than I. Chad?
Thanks very much, Jane, and thank you, Rich. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I had volunteered to assist Liz and Ed on the energy task group just before the break, and I did it over the chat. Just wanted to make sure that that was observed, and Liz, Ed would welcome the opportunity to lend a hand there. So if you want to catch up offline at some point, I'd be happy to do that. But thanks.
Thank you, Chad. So I can't see, I see Donna's waving her hand.
So I believe George might have been first and then
George, yeah. George.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to identify a couple of what might be prospective blind spots in the discussions you've had today in that policy proposal template that might merit inclusion. The first one I'd like to talk about is a funding mechanism. My perspective is that on the long haul, your federal monies are going to obviously get you started out of the gate, but you have to think about in the longer term a approach that puts money in the bucket to sustain what you've started. And what that might look like is legislative recommendations that haven't been identified yet on that funding mechanism, and identifying the scale of the mechanism. What's the budget you would assign to each of these different policies that you're talking about? And another blind spot would be identifying an organizational entity or persons who are actually accountable for the deliverables, whatever they might be, in the timeframes that they're obliged to complete those milestones. These are all the elements of a plan you might see in the corporate world that I was familiar with. And I think they have a lot of value. They get things done. And to that point, I'd say it would help your discussions a lot. It would bring some more focus to them, because you can then decide which things you can delegate out to parties that aren't necessarily at the table today, but could be engaged in the future. There you go.
Thank you.
George, I just a quick response. I think if you look at the milestones deliverables for the Vermont Climate Council as a whole, the sort of, they have, the full council has specifically started with the policy recommendations, the policy and program recommendations themselves. And then the step as those are finalized is to bring in that financing, that funding and financing picture together at that point, sort of in the October timeframe, as more clarity comes into focus around the scale of different activities, so that we're talking in the right order of magnitude and all those things. And so I think it's not necessarily a blind spot. We're just not there yet. But I hear you. And then the last column, which you guys didn't get to see, or the last two columns you guys didn't get to see because I was on pause, was the idea of who's charged with implementing the program. So we are responding to that sort of, as the legislature says, I need one throat to choke. That would be sort of where that person lives.
Hopefully it never comes to that.
Right, thank you. Donna, back to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point about that has to do with equity. A lot of new construction of affordable housing comes to a point where they want to do the most efficient thing. They're spending the money that a lot of private developers are not, to make these projects as efficient as possible. But they sometimes run into a wall of just not having adequate resources to put in the highest efficiency heating systems. So the equity point comes in to play that in some ways affordable housing is a bit like weatherization, in that it's what is affordable is what gets put in. And a number of developers gave presentations even in Efficiency Vermont's last conference about how they would have liked to have put in higher efficiency electric equipment, but they couldn't afford it. And so I think you really want to divide new construction programs. A lot of it's going to be dealt with by codes and requirements and things like that. But I think the affordable housing needs to get some kind of rebate programs. There should be eligible for rebate programs similar to weatherization, just because it's so much cheaper to do it right the first time. And for the most part, the agencies that are doing affordable housing are trying very hard to do the right thing, but the money's not always there, which is the second point. Bob Duncan has done a lot of affordable housing, and he said they cannot finance through banks or most lending institutions solar panels. Mortgages, they will not allow financing of renewable equipment on buildings. So I think you got to focus somehow on the lending institutions that are writing mortgages, because they're holding things back. And so to a certain extent are realtors who, many of them recognize that houses need to be weatherized, but they don't want to hold up a sale. And so they're kind of getting in the way of these programs. So I would definitely be talking to bankers and realtors in terms of what they see as opportunities and why it's such a stumbling block for them. They need to be at the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further from members of the public? Any closing comments from members of the committee? All right. Let me just say, as always, it's been a pleasure to spend time with you. Looking forward to bearing down on specific program ideas in our next two meetings.
So right before we go, I just want to talk quickly about next steps. Jane and I will work on the template and get that to you. We'll also fill in the work plan piece and bring that to you for further refinement and discussion. We did have a conversation around evaluating the MCA tool from Ag and Eco and whether or not we want to put a small group together to look at whether that might work for us. Does anybody want to volunteer for that work? I think Lauren, you get volunteered automatically. All right, well,
Lauren, I can look at that with you.
Rich and Peter, do we know who's up at the next meeting? I mean, I'd be willing to have transportation ready, assuming we get the template in the next few days, to give us enough time.
you are already going, we already assigned you.
Okay.
So it's transportation and non-energy are up next week or next meeting.
Non-energy goes first. Look forward to following in your footsteps, Peter.
And so you'll have the template to us soon.
Yes.
Doesn't need to be tomorrow, but not 2 days
Yes.
before. Okay, cool.
All right, yes, so it's non-energy and transportation next time, and the other two on the 20th.
Rich, I do want to, looks like there's somebody on the phone who ending in 9763 who might want to make a public comment.
No, it's Christine. So I'm a member of the public, but I'm also a member of the committee. Is it fair to say that we'll likely have the template by the end of this week? I just want to be as specific as I can be with Dave Farnsworth, who's not on the call today.
I would say that you will have it by the beginning of early next week. Jane and I will try to get it done. I was actually just about to chat her to see about her availability today and tomorrow, but we are.
It's a holiday.
Get it to you as quickly. Yeah, and then Monday is a holiday. So,
okay.
But yes, you will have it by Tuesday at the latest.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And anything further? All right, I think we're done for today and we stand adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.